Welcome everyone to the De Novo Elements Physiology 2 panel. I'm Ben Esgro and I'm joined by Eric Helms, Chad Dolan, Brian Miner, Jake Ormes, Mike Tuchscherer, and Carzoli. We have 5 questions for this month, and as usual, we're not going to waste any time and get right into the first one. So the first question is, what would be appropriate assistance lifts or corrective techniques for a sticking point that's a few inches out of the hole of the squat, assuming no form breakdown or loss of tightness? Chad, will you start us off on that question?
Sure. And I've read this a few times today, and I have to say that, I've been trying to visualize a squat all day that you get stuck immediately after the reversal of the motion. You have no sort of technical breakdown or form breakdown, and I'm just not able to visualize or recall me ever seeing that problem. So my assumption would be,
that they're a liar. They're just lying about it.
No, not necessarily that they're a liar. They just might not be aware of what's going on. So it could be something as simple as a loss of tightness through the core, through the glutes. It could be small rotations in the shoulder girdle, or you're having this compensatory movement pattern that's disrupting your overall squat mechanics, and you're not picking it up because it's not a glaring issue. It's probably a small one. So, in my head, the most common things I've seen immediately after hitting the bottom of your squat and starting to come back up is, you lose tightness or you don't know how to use your glutes. So if you think about pushing your knees out to the side and trying to squeeze your hips forward towards your knees and just push them back in between your knees and your shoulders, whenever you're reversing the motion, that seems to help me cue it to myself and to lifters that I coach. A lot of times there's a small rotation. You see the elbows flare out past or towards the back side of the body. You're going to have a small rotation in the shoulder girdle. If that happens, basically the bar's not going to move up until your shoulders are done moving and your hips come back underneath you. So I always tell people to think about, if someone's trying to push them down from the shoulders, the bar is trying to push them forward, arch their upper back into the bar and squeeze the bar as they go down. And that usually helps them correct that small, chink in the armor there. But those are the 2 things that most people probably overlook at first glance that cause any sort of delay in that squat coming back up.
Of course, I have an input, but Ty, we'll let you take a swing first.
All right. So I think, and I don't say this to belittle or patronize the person that asked the question at all, but we have to recognize that sometimes your only weakness is that you're too weak. And this kind of sounds like one of those examples. It sounds like that might be a strength-related deficiency if you're getting stuck right out of the hole. And I agree with Chad. I thought about it a lot, and that sounds a lot like the beginning of a failed squat, where strength is a limiting factor. I don't really see many instances where somebody gets stuck there. That's the beginning, really. If you get a couple inches, the stretch reflex, there's a lot of, unfortunately, people rely on very passive means to get back out of the hole, and I think that's the type of thing that will have you hit a wall right there. I don't know that Mike T would probably be the best one to answer about training specific phases of the movement. But I don't know, and I'd have to default to him for a better answer on exactly what to do for that. But I also agree, I have seen people come out and lose some momentum there where they are losing stability. So I would kind of echo what Chad said and say, maybe you're missing something, maybe you're dropping too fast. I've had a bunch of your clients, Ben, who just dove into the hole totally out of control. You bounce out, you get a couple inches, but that's completely uncontrolled. The brace is shot. You don't have a chance of executing that lift, especially not safely. So with respect to the person who asked the question, I'm not sure that there are too many instances where that's truly taking place.
Yeah, I would tend to agree there. But before we open it up to kind of a follow-up question there, anybody else have any input, or are we all kind of in that consensus? Go ahead, Mike and Eric, but Mike first.
Got in there first, right? So I read this question and I have kind of a mental conception of what I think this looks like. So I'll just kind of lay that out there, and it'll be up to whoever's listening to figure out if that applies to them or not. One thing I've said before is kind of the most common compensation pattern that you see is something I call kind of a chest fall pattern. When somebody first starts to come out of the hole and they're approaching a limit lift, you'll see the knees drift back and hips come up without the bar really moving up that much. Some people kind of refer to it as a good morning squat. It doesn't have to be that pronounced, in order to see that sort of a compensation pattern. This would be, in my imagination, what you would see with a limit squat where that doesn't happen. You don't see that kind of chest fall pattern. My default testing at this point is to train hip extension, and more recently, even going into the realm of more, I guess, even to the point of like doing adductor work and things of that nature. I just want to kind of highlight that any of this is just kind of a good idea in terms of a starting point for your own self-experimentation. You may try doing more hip extension work, so some things like some wide stance squats or doing good mornings or RDLs or something like that in terms of more supplemental lifts to help drive your squat. But if that doesn't produce results in the actual competition movement, you've got to try something else. So that would be kind of my idea of where to start.
Yeah, I really like that you that brought up that point as well that wasn't touched on before that, which is there is a lot of opportunity in that. Eric, I know you wanted to chime in.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to say is that maybe perhaps we're taking the question too literally, and when they say a couple of inches, it might be more like 6 or 7 inches and closer to where the more typical sticking point that we might be familiar with out of the hole is. And if that's the case, I think that's a pretty common stick point actually in lifts, and it may have a very different answer. The person might be sitting there going, well, I didn't mean it like literally 2 inches out of the hole, so and if that's the case, I think that will probably always be your and many people's stick point. It's just a matter of getting stronger, and can you maintain tightness and the appropriate form when you hit that stick point. I think is the only thing I would add in addition to everything else that everyone else said. I think that's all valuable advice and training hip extension, stuff like that.
Go ahead, Ty.
So Ben, because I think the same person might inevitably be wondering why nobody mentioned this, I'll just bring it up for the group, and you guys can kind of contribute your ideas on it. So what about lowering the pins down and squatting from those, like essentially pausing with the bar resting at the bottom and doing pin squats? This is nothing I do, nothing I've ever done, but I have a suspicion somebody might be wondering if that's a viable option to train. So you essentially start from a dead stop with the weight supported.
Well, is
that clear? Everyone knows what I'm talking about. I don't know the actual name of that, but
let's have Jake and Brian take it first, and then Mike T, since you raised your hand, you can go after. So Jake, do you have any input on that one?
That's not something I've ever really done either or advised people to do. So, I mean, I don't really know. I guess it's hard to say like how that would help. Maybe if you're like literally just trying to think about positioning, but in a normal squat, that's not what you're going to be doing. So I don't know. I have a hard time like I guess suggesting or trying to figure out like how that could be better than squatting and just trying to maintain form as best as possible.
Yeah, I think real quick, this is just a real quick addition to that, Brian, before you add. I think the major question for me is, does it detract from them actually addressing the real issue, which is like, are they trying to solve something in this weird ass-backwards nonlinear way that actually makes them more confused rather than addressing their technique breakdown and their strength? Brian?
So I agree with what everybody said. Kind of going back to what Helms said, it seems when I read this question, I interpreted it as not being exactly 2 inches, but I know for me personally, I get stuck like 5 inches out of the hole. And it's sort of that crossroads between kind of the passive tension that Ty touched on and then just active muscular contraction. And I think one thing that things like pause squats and pin squats can do is sort of take that passive element out of it and can force us to rely a little bit more on active contraction coming out of the bottom of the squat. I don't use them for regularly for kind of the reasons that you mentioned, Ben, just because I feel like if you can get strong in that movement without, the extra variation, you're going to be able to be a bit more specific and be strong to the point where you can just be hitting that sticking point with a little bit more speed to begin with to overcome it before like the active tension kind of takes over and finishes the lift.
Mike T.
So let me try to give like the quick 2-minute version of how I think of exercise selection. So there's the competition lift, and that's pretty self-explanatory. From there, I think of what I call assistance exercises, which are movements that closely resemble the competition lift, but maybe have like one small tweak. So things like pin squats or pause squats would fall under that category. And then the third category is supplemental movements. Those are movements that train similar muscles, slightly different energy systems, different movements. So in terms of squatting, you can think of things like good mornings, RDLs, lunges, stuff like that. Still trains the same muscles that are involved, but definitely different movement patterns. So with a pattern like what we're talking about here, I would typically want to push the athlete to the point where we do see some sort of minor technical breakdown. Like I mentioned, the chest ball pattern, some people don't show that, but maybe they'll show like a squish at the bottom, which tends to be kind of some spinal flexion as they start to come out of the hole. But maybe they really don't show any of those, in which case I would just train general bottom end strength. So we're going to train the competition exercise, which that's the big rocks in the jar. As far as assistance work, I'm thinking things like pause squats and pin squats. I do use those quite a bit. But then as far as supplemental work, it's since those are more focused on muscles anyway, it's kind of a toss up in the scenario where you don't have clear deficiencies showing up. So I would try a number of things. I would probably start with quads because it's a squat. When in doubt, make your quads strong. And test it and see how your real world results pan out. So it's kind of my 2-minute spiel there.
Well, I think we probably answered more than they were even asking in that question. So just for sake of time, we'll move on to the second one, which is, would there be any benefits of programming both a zercher and a front squat into training when one is unable to back squat due to recovering from a herniated disc in their lower back? Or would it be more optimal to focus on just one? So Ty, you could start us off again there.
All right. And first, as a little CYA, I hope everyone understands this is not any sort of medical advice. So if you do have a herniated disc, you need to have that managed by a professional, not just listen to online videos. But
there is a professional in Colorado that just opened practice, I believe. Yes,
this is true. I know a guy. So I would truly, I'd stick to one. I would stick to front squat, and I would just period. And it's the only one I would include either way, herniated disc or not. Personally, I don't claim to know a ton about, but I don't see a ton of value in the zercher squat. If any of you guys are more experienced with it and want to counter that, I invite you to. But I would stick to front squat between those two and spend most of your time and energy there. I definitely think it'll convert better, and I think it's going to be closer to the loads you'll be training with. Also, obviously, be careful if it is symptomatic. Use your best judgment, proceed cautiously. A lot of us, we know a lot of people that are asymptomatic have herniations, and you can get by pretty fine with them, but don't be dumb, don't put your training before your health. So navigate that cautiously, because if you do damage some of these things in a more extreme way, the recovery can be long and incomplete at times, and that would be a lot worse. To take off a couple months from training or dial it back more is favorable to more permanently injuring yourself. Ben, you could probably talk at length about some of that based on your experience. So,
yeah, I'm definitely no stranger to herniated discs in the lower back. So I think my addition would be just kind of building off of what you said is what are the triggers? So is it flexion induced or extension induced? And then you have to kind of go off of there. So you need to have some type of logical framework where you can actually have a first principle and then reason up from there of how you should address it. So I think that should kind of be the first question you ask. Now, because this person isn't here able to tell us that, I'm going to have to go off of assumption. And I will say that the odd part about a front squat is it puts the resistance pretty far in front of the your center of mass, which is going to make you tend to fall forward more. So that, and usually that's going to put a lot of strain on your lower back, especially because you can't low bar a front squat. So it's even further away from your center of mass. So I think the one advantage of a zercher there is while it's not as applicable, the resistance is much closer to your center of mass. So the potential of sway and the shear force on your lower back is going to be lower. But again, there's a massive asterisk in that answer, which I think goes back to my first part of it, which is which one triggers the pain, and then reason from there. Anybody else want to jump in on that one? Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, actually, those were my thoughts exactly, Ben. I haven't done a zercher, but if I had a lower back issue, I probably wouldn't be doing a front squat. But I also would counter this individual's question with, have they considered, depending on where it is post-injury, have they considered something like BFR bodyweight squats? Have they considered BFR like belted squats or hip-loaded squats below the waist? Those are going to effectively train the quads and keep some muscle mass and some activity below their injury, but also not load above the injury or, risk any sort of re-injury.
Yeah. Two things I'm going to say really quick because I want everybody else to jump in here. What I've noticed really helpful exercises for that condition specifically are the belt squat machine, again, because the resistance is below you, and actually you get a little bit of spinal tractioning, which can be nice if you're getting too much pressure on the discs. And then step-ups. You can do weighted step-ups holding the weight at your sides as well, like dumbbells or plates. So I guess the one thing to appreciate for anybody, not just the person asking this, but anybody who deals with a lower back injury, and assuming it's going to be a lot of people who powerlift, there's a pretty large wheel of options you have. So don't just try to immediately go into the two most common next things, which I would consider probably like a zercher and a front. So Eric, you raised your hand first, and then Mike T, you can follow up.
Yeah, my advice is very simple. It's there's two sides to the coin. You want to look at how do I keep all of the machinery that allows me to do a squat. We'll basically call that your muscular adaptations, your actual hypertrophy, which is really easy. Like you could do hip thrust, leg extension, leg curl, and abductor machine, and you could find a way to isolate all those without putting any strain on your lumbar. And if you were a bodybuilder, it wouldn't even matter. I've had people get on stage who don't squat or deadlift, and you'd never know it because of an injury. From the powerlifting side of it, that's a little tougher, and then you basically need to think of, okay, what's the closest thing I can do to a squat and a deadlift that is pain-free, and I mean free, or you're just going to be risking it as you get stronger and stronger. And that might be like a leg press and a hex bar deadlift, or it might be a zercher or whatever, but I would encourage you to the person asking the question to experiment a little bit with light loads until they find something that they can comfortably load that doesn't cause any pain, and then just kind of build on that while they're recovering.
Yep, very very practical. Mike T.
I guess I just want to throw in a testimonial for what Ben was describing just a minute ago, because that's basically what I've done. I have a bulging disc. Now, granted, mine is super mild compared to what a lot of people deal with. It doesn't bother me at all in my day-to-day life. It only affects me when I have a sufficient spinal shear. So think like a good morning or a low bar squat or a deadlift. Those types of things will bother it. But for me, things like front squats are asymptomatic. I would be hesitant to do like a zercher squat because it tends to try to round me over a bit more, and having to fight against that. And when you get fatigued and you're approaching, a failure point, that's going to be the kind of compensation that happens. So for me, in my situation, that's what I've done. Somebody else with, like just what Ben was saying, if somebody's got symptoms presenting in a different way, you're going to chase the rabbit in a different direction, So, yeah, I guess testimonial for Ben's approach.
Yeah, I think just a final capstone on that as well is I think the one thing that needs to be considered for every answer that we give here is a lot of it is anatomically dependent too. So we can talk about, theoretically in a textbook case, what should happen, but there's a lot of anatomical outliers in powerlifting. And like you said, Mike, you might get rounded in a zercher, and therefore it actually eliminates the answer of having the bar further away from the axis of rotation. We're going to move on to 3. This is a fairly longer one, and Jake, we'll have you start with this one. If one is unable to deadlift due to injury, would you be able to maintain the majority of your strength by implementing a single leg RDL, hip thrusts, reverse hypers, and back extensions? So actually, Eric, you kind of touched on this. Similarly, would lunges and Bulgarian split squats maintain the majority of squat strength as long as the volume and intensity is high enough? Jake?
So it's kind of tough to say, I think, like whether exactly you're going to be able to maintain your strength. However, I think kind of as everybody mentioned, you can split up the movements and find things that are not painful. And I think that's the big key, is to just find things that are not painful. And basically just train for hypertrophy with those movements. And then from there, make progressions, kind of like Mike T mentioned, into those areas that are closer to the main lift. As far as these like specific movements, if you have, and again, I'm like no expert like on herniated discs. I do have my own back issues. I know that some of these would make me worry more than others, just for my own symptoms. Again, for you, it may be different. But things like the reverse hypers or perhaps the back extensions, where I guess it depends on what gives you pain, but like, I don't know, those seem like movements that can tend to involve like higher velocity, maybe, especially with like the reverse hyper, and place more stress on that area than is necessary. I don't know. Just personally, I don't have much problem with hip thrusts. RDLs, I guess, it would depend on if you get pain or not. And just again, to reiterate, I think the only progressing when you are pain-free and starting to really load the movement is just really critical, because that pain has a high potential to mess up your movement patterns. You may not even realize it, but you might start moving differently. So if you try to go back to the movements too quickly, your form could get a little wonky. So just a note there.
Yeah, I think that's a really very important, valid point that you finished on there that most people don't consider. Eric?
I think we've addressed variations of this question a lot. We've talked about movement variations, specificity, kind of the increasing size concentric circle of specificity that Mike T talked about, moving from the competition to assistance to secondary or whatever you want to call it. And we've also talked about injury, and I think a lot of those same concepts apply here. Is you want to find the most specific thing you can do that's pain-free, and then you do want to spend the rest of your time doing things that are non-specific but at least assist that movement, and then also do whatever the hell your medical professional is telling you to do to actually recover from that injury. So yeah, I think like you just said, it's going to be so specific to your anatomy, the type of injury you have, where you're at, and your recovery from that giving more specific advice than that is probably not going to be helpful. So I think I'm just going to defer back to what's already been said, to be honest.
Yeah, the only component that I do want to touch on that I feel like we haven't yet is just where they ask about maintaining the majority of their strength, and they do acknowledge that it's neurological.
Actually, that is something I can add to. Is you'd be surprised how quickly your strength can come back, and how much you can maintain with just a minimal amount of the movement. So I'll give my personal testimonial here. I recently, 5 months ago, I had hip surgery to deal with FAI and bilateral on both sides. And for the 3 years prior to that surgery, my frequency of squats came down to literally at the last year 5 squats in a year. And my squat max in competition was exactly the same as it was in 2013 as it was in 2016, the last comp I did. I squatted 222.5 kilos, which was right what I had before I could keep squatting. So training all those other things and still being able to train the deadlift and training hypertrophy, and then just having a minimal amount of skill work, specific skill work, heavy in comp basically in a few weeks prior, was enough for me to lose 0 strength, even only doing 5 squats a year. So I think worrying about how much strength you're going to lose and having that fear change your game plan as far as what's healthiest is probably the biggest risk, and the most frequent error that I see is someone goes, well, I don't want to lose all my strength, I've got to do some squatting or some deadlifting, and they do it despite the fact that it's injuring them worse, when in reality, once they were fully, I'll give you another example, is I went from squatting 0 to 170 kilos within 6 weeks of coming back to it, and that's just me just doing a single and adding what I felt comfortable to, and squatting to like a 6 RPE, just as I've come back into it. And if I'm pain-free, I go up, and I'm just kind of letting it creep back to where it was. And it's happening very, very rapidly because those movement patterns are still in there, and muscle mass has not been lost. So I think don't operate based on fear if you have an injury. Do what you need to do, and then when you come back to it, let the strength come back. That's probably the best perspective I can give.
Yeah, I think long-term approach is something that's really maybe undervalued and under discussed in strength sport, and I get it because it's getting more and more competitive, and everybody wants to be at the top and stay there. But the reality is, you do have a life that you have to live after competitive powerlifting, unless you're someone like Dave Ricks and you're still dominating like into your 60s. But yeah, I think that's a really important thing to consider, really in anybody who's listening, and not as well, if we could tap into that audience. So we'll go to the next question, since it is.
Ben, can I add just one thing real quick?
Sure.
As a general rule of thumb, for exercise selection, especially in someone with a herniated disc, aim for things that are going to maintain spinal neutrality. A lot of these can kind of put a big torsional or rotational stress on the spine, or a big flexion stress, or a big hyperextension stress. Those are the things you really want to avoid under load, period, especially when you have a herniated disc. So really, and the goal, of course, with a one-leg dead RDL would be to limit any sort of rotational component. But why put yourself in a position where you're extra susceptible to that type of stress when you can avoid it? I think it would just be best to, again, navigate that cautiously and stick with things that are going to maintain neutrality.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that the entire time you guys were talking, is I find it interesting when someone has an injury, they want to remove points of contact or bases of support. And that's, like Ty was mentioning, that's the last thing you want to do. If you're injured, don't take one leg away. That's your lifeline. That's stability. Sit down, put your back up against something. Like Eric said, your strength isn't going to go anywhere. You didn't gain it in a month. You're not going to lose it in a month if you keep doing something.
Something actually I'll let you jump in. This is really quick. Something I do want to mention to anybody who has back injuries that I think is invaluable, and there's no excuse to not buy it for like $20 some. Is The Back Mechanic by Stu McGill. I've met him. He's awesome. Great person, super knowledgeable. And that book is really easily digestible. It's made for the lay audience. And it will help you. Really, everything we've kind of revolved around talking about, like trigger points and stuff, or trigger exercises and movements, it addresses all of that stuff and how to correct it. So definitely pick that up. Brian, go ahead.
So the last point I was going to make was actually going back to expand a little bit on what Eric and Mike had in terms of their personal experiences, because I think what Eric touched on with just the fear of losing these neurological adaptations, I think that oftentimes makes the situation a lot worse. And Ben, this is something that I know I've talked to you about. A couple of years ago at the Arnold, my knee was really bothering me. And I think the last 6 weeks, each week, I think I did a total of like 3 reps on squat, and the rest of it was just all BFR work. And I was pretty mind blown at not only how much I could retain, but it was probably the best peak I've actually had for a meet. it was mildly frustrating at the time because I wanted to know why. It's like this shouldn't be the case, but it was a good lesson, because I think, when you remove that fear of losing strength and you remind yourself that it's going to come back, what's going to feel like almost immediately. 6 weeks in a training career is very short. So I think a lot of people are looking for ways to optimize that timeline, but it's like if you're going to optimize the timeline if you spend the right amount of time away from the competition lift to begin with. So I just wanted to throw my additional anecdote in there too.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so this one's a rapid fire question, so we're going to get everybody's input. We'll just kind of go around the panel. So what is the one training or nutritional implementation change that you found most effective in the last year? So we'll start with Eric.
Great question. And thank you for starting with me, because I have to leave. But I've actually had a lot of success with BFR. And I think it's specific to me, not as necessarily a way to fix an injury, but I got exposed to it because I simply couldn't train at post-hip surgery normally. And I realized it was a very useful way to get hypertrophy work done with just putting less stress on a joint. So Ty, you'd remember this. I had massive elbow tendonitis while I was loading plates for my PhD study while I was at FAU, because I was in there 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, except for the 1 week where I went to Disneyland with my wife. So I'm just going to say it because they would say it for me if I didn't, somewhere in the comments. Anyway, but got massive elbow tendonitis, and I just found that anytime I went back to curls, it would flare up. And I needed to curl. I'm a bodybuilder. So I started doing lightweight curls with occlusion every other day almost, and didn't have any issue just because of less total joint strain. I was also doing hammer curls and not doing, supination. And similarly, while I was recovering from surgery and I couldn't do axial loading, and I was doing leg extensions and leg curls, being the idiot bodybuilder I am, I actually started to get knee pain because I was going so heavy on leg extensions, and I actually got a minor strain in my hamstring going heavy on leg curls, because again, I'm an idiot and I have to push hard. So when I then went to BFR on both of those and all of my single joint work, I've just felt fresh all the time, and I've also actually gained size. It's the first time I've put on size on my arms in a long time, and I think it's just because the requisite amount of volume that I needed to do to progress at this stage of my career in terms of hypertrophy for those muscle groups was high enough that the way I was doing it with traditional heavy training, because that's the way I like to train, the bottleneck was my joints. So just being able to reduce the total joint stress load on certain movements has allowed me to do the volume that I need to see progress in certain areas, which is kind of cool. So that's the big one for me.
Well, thank you for dropping and going. Thank you for being with us again this month, and we will see you next panel. Chad.
So the biggest thing I have found work is implementing. One is maybe if I'm not training above like an 8, maybe 9 RPE, I probably don't need to rest 5 minutes anymore. And two, you can train antagonistic muscle groups for a week or two, and then it doesn't feel like you're drowning mid-set after you make that initial adaptation. So from a time standpoint, I think, Mike, you've talked about training density in the past, actually, but I basically just increased the density of my workouts because I didn't have the luxury of training 21 hours a week and having my office next to a squat rack. So I just had to make it work.
Hold on, the order got screwed up there when we lost Eric. So I think Jake would be next.
So maybe not necessarily for me, but more so for clients, is doing making sure there's a structured plan for intra-session autoregulation. So utilizing RPEs more so and in combination with percentage-based work. So, I mean, it's not like before I was completely rigid and just telling people, no, like you only can do this. But it just wasn't as structured, and I found that people, as opposed to being able to complete work and feel good about it within like a structured paradigm, rather than that, it was kind of just like an extra stressor and making them kind of feel bad as like, oh, like this was my assigned load for today and I couldn't do it. So yeah, I found that, and it also eliminates a lot of just back and forth texting and messaging when there's a plan already in place.
Mike T.
Probably the biggest thing that I've learned in the last year has been just the strategic use of variation. I think among all the coaches here, I probably include more variation in the training that I write than anyone else. But I think it's important not to just shotgun that variation out there all the time, just changing things willy-nilly. I would even go as far as to say changing volumes and intensities on a week-to-week basis is oftentimes overkill. I've gone really hard the other way in terms of keeping training super, super consistent and really monitoring the results, watching to see the athlete's responses. And I've been able to learn so much more about my own individual response and all the individual responses for my athletes. For example, my bench press really responds well to high intensities, but I have some athletes who really don't respond well to high intensities. They do a lot better if we stay more in the 70 to 80% range, which for me wouldn't work that well. I would never have noticed those types of individual differences if I hadn't stopped changing stuff all the time for no reason and implemented a system that allows me to see what's going on.
Yeah, that's definitely huge. Ty?
So I actually opened a practice this year, and that has massively distracted from the time I can allocate toward training. And so something I think I've sort of had to learn is what actually Eric alluded to earlier, is that you can maintain a decent amount of strength just training with even infrequently. And my intensity has been down, my volume's been down, my frequency's been down, but I've made some effort to get in there a couple days a week when I can. There have been times I've gone a week without training, and it hasn't been the end of the world for my strength, and that's an important thing, I think, especially these people with the injuries, most relevant to them. But there are times and phases we go through life where training can't be a priority. It wouldn't be responsible to spend as much time on that. And that's okay. Get in when you can. Lift heavy when you can, get volume in where you can, but don't stress about it. You will still be strong. And you can even make some gains depending on, which lifts we're talking about. So it's been a good one.
Yeah. Brian.
So I've got two. One of them is actually nutrition related, and I'll finish with that one. But as far as training, one thing I've been doing more, and I'd be interested in hearing some of the other feedback on this, is when I'm programming both for myself and other athletes, once I start to get above that 80 to 83, 85% range, I've started to sort of have an inverse relationship between relative intensity and absolute intensity. So what I mean by that is, like, say I'm doing a triple at 85%, which for most people will be like an 8 or an 8.5 RPE. I might, like, say I'm doing 3 by 3 there. I might end up doing, dropping that to doubles and equating volume, or say I did 3 by 4. So I might do 2 by 6, or 2 reps for 6 sets. That way my RPE per set is lower. I'm equating volume, but it's at an intensity enough where I'm getting close to full recruitment out of the gate. And I think with those higher intensities, you can kind of get away with doing that a little bit more. And I've noticed, when I do this, I'm fresher for each subsequent set. So it's ingraining that technique. And the biggest thing that I've noticed is it's just less stressful, just mentally. I think knowing that you're not going to have to grind your last set to like a 9 RPE can be very beneficial. And you can take shorter rest periods. And I've noticed the time it takes to do that is shorter. And I think just the total, if you could really even quantify this, the total accrued fatigue throughout that protocol, 12 reps at 85% as a whole, is going to be a little bit less, but you're getting the same amount of qualitative work in, if that makes sense.
Well, I think this is essentially what you pretty much just wrote about for elements as well, right?
Yeah. And this is sort of expanded. That was sort of the next phase of implementing some of these, but yeah. That's go ahead.
So I'm just going to go real quick and pretty much just kind of agree with the theme of what everybody said, which is the art of kind of letting go a little bit and it not being the end of the world. So I think I don't know if I'd say most effective, but definitely most impactful as a human outside of just lifting weights, is that it doesn't need to dominate your life in order to still be enjoyable and still get something back from it. So and you know what, within that theme, I've also noticed for myself with programming and writing for clients is you can actually chill a little bit and still get a fair amount back. So I think I was, for a while, I was in an emergency phase of I need to get everybody as much as they can get in, X time period. So within the art of my own stepping back a little bit, I think I've been able to kind of step back a little bit more with people I've trained, and I think be able to see, I don't know if I'd say bigger picture as much as I'd say see the context of lifting and powerlifting progress within a life rather than from contest to contest, if that makes sense. Anybody else have anything to kind of bring up?
I did have one nutrition related thing, just because he included that in the question, so I figured it'd be worth touching on. So dieting, like in fat loss phases, like I'm in the middle of a prep right now, and I have had like 3-day or like back-to-back refeeds this time around, rather than like a refeed on Sunday and Wednesday or something like that, spread evenly. I've been doing 4 days low, 3 days high, effectively just getting out of the deficit completely on those days. And even in both scenarios, if you were to average calories out, it feels like it's been a complete game changer just in terms of my ability to perform in the subsequent week, like heading into that next week. Just my performance in the gym is a lot better. And I feel, I mean, Ben, I know you've done a show, and Jake, I know you have too. It's like you
at a time of my
life. I didn't get blood work done at any point, prior to this, but I just based on the way I feel, I just feel like some of those adaptations I've held off on some of those. I've sort of pushed them down the road a little bit with this strategy. And I just feel more alive than I probably should at this stage, which is, and the only thing I've really changed is just that refeed structure. And I think, calories, being relatively equal, I made that change and felt an immediate impact. And I think that's something I know Eric's talked on in webinars before, is some of the research behind like prolonged duration refeeds. So it's an interesting topic, but just wanted to throw that out there too.
Yeah. Well, I'd actually like to, if we can remember, touch on something like that again when we come back around to nutrition. So we will move on to the final question, which Brian will have you start off on this one again as well. How receptive would the body be to its first intentional building phase if one has been training for several years but never started correctly with, a correct building phase? And how should they best approach this? That might be difficult to kind of consolidate that all into one answer, but if you can.
Yeah, so the way I interpreted that question is, like, if you were to take a beginner who's optimized their nutrition and training versus someone who's experienced, who's been working suboptimally up to this point, like comparatively, how can they progress? And it depends. Like the root of this question is, I think, looking for a quantifiable answer, and it doesn't exist. I would say a beginner is going to make, in general, if you have any training experience, better progress. But in your situation, say you've been training for 3 years, but it's suboptimal, you're going to be making better progress than somebody who's been training for 3 years that has had more structure. So it's all relative, and in that time that you've been training, how much progress have you actually made? Because I think that's one big indicator of where you're at in compared to your ultimate ceiling there. So like where to start? I mean, I think just a very foundational component is just to make sure that you're implementing some form of progressive overload, because I think that's where a lot of beginners get it wrong and spin their wheels and waste some of their time, is they just don't have a progressive strategy to their training in general. And then the nutrition side of it, if you're building, I focus on the main pieces here, just total caloric intake, sufficient protein intake, progressive overload in your training, and you're going to be fine. But to answer the root of the question is, there isn't an answer. Like there's not a way to assess that. So
yeah, Mike Tuchscherer.
I thought about this question a number of different ways, and I kind of came back to the unsatisfying conclusion that it doesn't matter. You are where you are, and you have the resources that you have. If you remember the movie Safe House, like the one with Denzel in it, and he's like this super spy. So anyway, in the opening scene of this movie, right, Denzel's the super spy, and he's like running away from these bad guys, and they're chasing him through the city, and he comes out into this alleyway, and there's bad guys behind him, bad guys to the left and right, and there's a U.S. consulate in front of him, and you come to find out that he eventually goes into the consulate and he gets tortured, right? So I was thinking about this scene, and like he's faced with this decision, like behind him and to the left and the right there's death, and then in front of him there's torture, like 4 bad options, but he doesn't hesitate about it. Like he doesn't like waste any time looking for this magical fifth option or anything. He just says, this is what's available. Torture's better than death, so I'm going that way. And I think a lot of us waste a lot of time looking for a magical option that, probably doesn't exist. The moral of that, as far as I can tell, is to accept where you're at. You've done a bit of training. It may have negatively affected you, or maybe it didn't, and no one knows and probably will ever know. But even if we did know, it wouldn't change anything. What you can do from here is the best that you can do from here, and that's all you can do. So I would definitely 100% focus on that.
Yeah, I really like that both of you guys gave, I think, both kind of A and B options of that. And I would, that's kind of how I took the question as well, though, Mike, which is, if you're constantly worried about the perfect intervention, you're just going to be totally spinning your wheels, and you can freak out about that forever. So I think the really important thing in that question is to remember that you learn from the shitty blocks and from the mistakes. So none of us are here from the first time we tried it having been perfect. So I think the mental framework is super important in how you're approaching training. So it's important to have a suck period, even if it's extended, because you will learn a lot from it. Unless you just keep doing it, then you might need to reassess another mental framework. Anybody, any closing remarks before we sign off?
Just an extension that I play guinea pig with myself so that I constantly reinforce the lesson to make the smallest change you're comfortable with, set it and forget about it, and then whenever it stops working, reassess. Because I would do the same thing.
Go ahead, Ty.
If I can just summarize what they've said in one flowery motivational poster, it would be the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. And that's really all it is. It's simple.
I like that capstone as well, but we need to sign off on Jake's final comment. It's the most important part of the panel. Come on, Jake, give us a sign off.
Do you want me to talk about this question?
Yeah. I just want a closing remark from Jake before we sign off.
All right. Well, I like what Chad said. Make the smallest incremental change that you possibly can, and kind of what everyone else has said. Just forget about whatever happened in the past, or at least use it just as a learning tool. And don't sweat it so much. Just kind of move forward, and like Chad said, when things stop working, then it's time to reassess. And in order to know that they're not working, make sure that you're keeping track of either weight, your loads, whatever metrics that are important to you, so that you know that things aren't moving in the right direction. And what you were doing when that happened.
I don't have anything else to say. Anybody else? Nope. Good. It's unanimous. Well, thank you guys, everybody, for contributing. Thank you again for submissions, as with every month. And we will see you again in roughly a month for the supplementation panel.